The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Salifu, and I am an organizer with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. As we always remind you, the A-APRP is an organization which was founded in Africa and is working toward the reality or the objective of one unified socialist Africa. At that point in time, we will have achieved Pan-Africanism, one major step toward global world communism. So like I said, I'm Salifu. I'm a member of the Kaji Work Study Circle in the party. And today we're going to have a conversation about music and how music and in relation arts and culture generally can be revolutionary. But before we get into that, like we always do, I want to honor an ancestor. The ancestor that I want to honor today is Brother Amiri Baraka. So Amir Baraka was a communist poet, writer, teacher, and political activist that was born in 1934 in Newark, New Jersey. Baraka was well known as a social critic. Oftentimes he wrote things that kind of got the flames sparked, and it made it difficult for a lot of people, especially petty bourgeois Africans, liberal-minded white people in the U.S., Europeans in the U.S., to jive with his work. People would go to his shows. People would read his work and say this is violent. They would say it was misogynistic. They would say it was anti-Semitic. You know, all the things that they say often when they want to discredit an African that is saying things that they do not like. So yeah, his work was very confrontational, but with a purpose. His goal, as he stated many, many times in his work, was to shock and awaken his audiences to the political concerns of African people in the U.S. He actually became radicalized by traveling to Cuba in 1960, which was like the year after Fidel Castro and the July 26 movement had taken power. And he went there to attend this like international conference for writers and array of artists from like different third world countries. He later said that like as a result of attending that conference in Cuba, he came to kind of understand art and politics being linked and that they should stay linked. Like you should not try to break the link. And so I wanted to honor Amiri Baraka today because his work inspires a lot of what I try to do as an artist. So just to like give some background, I played several instruments throughout my life. Most recently, I played alto saxophone. So that was like from middle school to high school. And then I came back 10 years later to my hometown to start working again as an assistant band director. So I currently work with like 75 kids in a high school band program. So I have seen a lot of different ways that music can be revolutionary. Well, music can be used in positive and like in a way that it like speaks to its positive characteristics, but also just like as a general consumer of music, just like as a regular everyday person who listens to the radio, who watches television. I also see a number of different ways that music can be used for counter-revolutionary aims. And because we are scientific socialists, we approach the world dialectically. So I want to talk today about how music can be and has been used as a weapon historically. Some of the pitfalls that kind of come from centering music as our main, or art in general, as our main tool toward liberation, and then talk about some ways that I think that we can avoid that. So music and arts generally as like a weapon in history. As African people, music and cultural arts are like just like a part of who we are, right? Like the same way in the party, Nkrumah was able to identify that you cannot organize Africans on the basis of atheism. I think it's safe to say that you cannot organize Africans or expect to be taken seriously or considered at all by African people if you discount the value or the power of art and culture. So therefore, in relation, music. So maroon societies, maroons. So these are Africans that escaped the plantations and went to like live in the swamps, live in the mountains, live in the woods, and create their own societies. From Jamaica to Cuba to Haiti to here in the U.S., maroons really took advantage of music as a way to convey messages, to plan rebellions, all those kinds of things. Being here in South Carolina, I can say that drums were a central part of many slave rebellions that occurred here in South Carolina, especially in the Low Country. And there was this one really big rebellion that happened in 1739. And as a result of that rebellion in 1940, South Carolina passed this thing called the Negro Act, which prohibited Africans from congregating in large groups. And it prohibited us from having access to drums. So think about what that means. It prohibited us from being able to congregate in large groups, aka to organize. And it prohibited us from using our cultural artifacts. So organizing and communicating, which are two really big parts of the way we continue to struggle today. But what's fascinating to understand is that even after the stand-up drum or a handheld drum was banned in places like South Carolina, Africans kind of like resorted to body percussion as a way to like maintain that cultural tie to our heritage, as well as to communicate with each other. Even beyond slavery, though, like and enslavement, African people have always used art, culture, music as a way to sort of like convey a message about what they are thinking or feeling or believing at any given point in time. So when you look at the decolonization movements across Africa, where African countries were fighting back against their colonizers and like asserting their right to be independent or live free. If you look at Guinea, for example, where Sékou Touré was, when Sékou Touré was elected the president of Guinea in 1958, he like spearheaded a whole cultural transformation in the country. So it wasn't this like very cold, gray, dry, this is a revolution, everybody go get in the factory, stop playing, that's enough playing for the day, get to work. Like, no, he was like, no, my people have to have like a cultural outlet. Otherwise, like A, the revolution will not succeed, and B, people will not be happy here. And the goal was not to make a society that people did not want to be in. The goal was to make a society that rivaled colonization, right? You want to make a society or a world where people are happy to be alive. So one of the things that Sékou Touré did was every region had to have an official music group. Every part of Guinea had to have like an official music group, and that music group got funded by the government. And so you could be that group, and imagine just being an artist that gets paid by your government to live, and all you're doing is making the sounds and the rhythms of the revolution. Because Sékou Touré wanted people to feel that inspiration of the music, but it also served a dual purpose. He wanted the world to learn the story of what was happening in Guinea, and not just in Africa, which was very important to him, that other African countries see and hear about what was going on in Guinea, to invite them to be a part of that process of building Pan-Africanism, but also to the larger world, to Europe, to the Americas, to Asia, to Latin America. He wanted people to be like, hey, we got some shit going on in Guinea that y'all need to like pay attention to. And rather than having people make long speeches or write essays, he was like, let's do it through music. Let's do it through cultural products. You also have, I think about other singers, people like Nina Simone, people like Miriam Makeba, people like Paul Robeson. When Paul Robeson sings, like you go on YouTube and you search videos of Paul Robeson singing like the national anthem of the Soviet Union. I don't think I've ever heard a better rendition. It like almost makes you want to cry every time. Nina Simone, the way she sang the blues and the heartbreak of African people living in the U.S., the anger, the frustration. Mary Makeba in South Africa, who sang the tune of apartheid. These are all people who understood that music is a force that can be used in a positive direction, right? And for revolutionary aims across almost all of Africa, wherever people were beginning to win battles for decolonization. What were some of the first things that they were doing, y'all? They were they were rejecting the national anthem of the United States. They were rejecting the national anthem of France, of Britain, of Germany, and writing their own national anthems, like almost sometimes like the day after. People had new national anthems, they had new flags, because they understood these things were tied to identity. It just kind of like always brings us back to this quote by Amilcar Cabral. When he said that national liberation requires a cultural revolution in which African people will reclaim our cultural heritage and use it to build a new society free from colonialism. So we see very clearly, like when we look back at history, music has always been used toward revolutionary aims. But this is the thing that we have to be very careful of. When we center art, music, or anything like that as like the main or primary strategy of our revolutionary consciousness, we have to understand that, again, as scientific socialists, when we understand the world dialectically, anything that can be used positively or anything that can be used for revolutionary aims can also be used negatively or for counter-revolutionary aims, right? So under capitalist and like colonialist modes of production, African cultural products are hijacked all of the time and repurposed for counter-revolutionary aims. One of the earliest examples of this, I think, that we can point to is jazz. So jazz was actually, many people do not know this, but jazz was used as a tool of imperialism during the Cold War. So when the U.S. was trying to defeat the Soviet Union for completely irrational reasons, I mean, the reason was rational. It was they did not want the world to see that socialism could exist and thrive. So it was very important to destroy the Soviet Union. But one of the ways that they did that was through using jazz. So they understood that the Soviet Union was involved in lending military and financial support to many of the movements for decolonization across Africa, across Latin America, and across Asia. So what the United States said was that we need to have a presence in these places as well. And we're going to use jazz to do that. So African jazz artists like Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie, they got sent around the world to different countries in Africa and Asia under the guise of you're just going to be there to play jazz. But what the U.S. did was it hijacked jazz as an African byproduct and made it an American product. And so it was there that they used jazz to sort of portray like, hey, if you implement democracy in your country, if you live under capitalism like we do, you know, you can have this cool, unique American experience that we are demonstrating here to you through jazz. It's a very sad story. I think Gerald Horne has a book about it that people should read. I will drop the links to everything that I'm talking about here in the description for people to follow up on. But yeah, jazz is one of the earliest examples of like Black people's cultural products being used by the U.S. to oppress other people. But not only does the U.S. use our products to oppress other people, they also use our products to oppress us. I mean, think about the way that hip hop and rap music have been turned against Black people, African people living in the U.S. Although hip hop's roots are sort of party music, hip hop came into sort of its mainstream iteration in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because it was a direct challenge to disco. Disco was a very indulgent music that kind of belonged to the petty bourgeoisie and like more bourgeoisie forces in the U.S. It was for people who could afford champagne, people who could afford cocaine, people whose lives were going really well, and all they really wanted to talk about was like drugs, sex, bling, money. Disco appealed to that kind of lifestyle. But for most Africans living in the U.S. at the time, especially African people living in New York and places like the Bronx, that was not their reality. People could not afford cocaine. People could not afford champagne. People could not afford fancy clothes. And so hip hop came to like talk about the reality of what people were dealing with. Now, fast forward to 2023, and when you look at the hip hop industry, and this started long before 2023 to be specific. The 90s and the early 2000s saw a huge period of commercialization of hip hop. So rappers went from being truth tellers to being mascots. Your favorite rapper is now the head, like the face of an alcohol brand or a cigarette brand or a clothing line. Hip hop artists go from being storytellers to being marketers and people who repeat words that are given to them by different cultural institutions. So when we fast forward to 2023, we look at specific trends in music like drill, for example. We look at specific trends in music. Well, let's stay with drill for a second, right? Drill music is like a very clear example of like a double-edged sword. It's music that reflects the reality that a lot of African youth are dealing with in the streets and at home and in schools today, which is like they've inherited a world that is primed by violence. Every aspect of their life is violent. So of course that's what they're going to talk about. But at the same time, you have these record labels who are primarily owned by non-Africans, largely Europeans, who have figured out that this kind of music sells. And so now they are aiding the creation of the lifestyle. There's no interest in removing violence from young Black children's lives. There's no interest in making their living conditions better. There's no interest in pouring back into them, giving them money, giving them tools, giving them resources. The interest is in exploiting the conditions that they live in. So it's like, oh yeah, it's really sad that like 14-year-olds where you live get killed, but like, can you make a song about it? And like, can you laugh about him getting killed on the track? And if you do that, we'll give you money. So we also are very careful not to blame young people for participating in this, because it is just an outlet. At the end of the day, it is an outlet, and there's a system that's being like dictated over their heads. But again, we look at drill, we look at the current state of hip hop, and we can see that hip hop has been completely taken out of the hands of Black people and is being fed back to us however other people want to give it to us. Hip hop, interestingly enough, also has not just been used against Black people in the US, but it's also been used against African people in Cuba. So since about 2009, the US government has spent millions of dollars trying to like create organic movements and like social unrest in Cuba using hip hop. So basically what they do is they say, okay, we know we have this economic blockade on your country that doesn't allow for food, medicine to come in. We won't allow you to bank with anybody else in the world. We have completely isolated you. We're starving you. We're ensuring that people don't have access to tools and materials to repair their homes, their houses. So they're admitting we are causing the suffering in Cuba. The United States says we are causing the suffering in Cuba, but also we don't want you to blame us. We want you to blame your government. And so what the United States did in 2009 is it used its USAID. We talk about them all the time. USAID. They contracted this program called Creative Associates International. It's like a firm, basically. And what the firm does is it goes around the world and it plants bogus ass artists in different countries. It will just either plant somebody in your country you've never seen before, and that person will begin to rise as like the new superstar. Or what they will do is they will commandeer artists who already live in the country by saying, in a place like Cuba, for example, you're hungry, your mom is poor, come talk to us, we got a contract for you. They'll call them over, they'll offer them thousands of dollars, maybe in some cases millions of dollars, world publicity. They'll send them on tour. They'll send them all around the world, but only if they rap or sing about certain kinds of things. So in the example of Cuba, there are Black hip hop artists who are being funded by the United States to make music against the Cuban government. So as long as they rap and they say they hate the government, they hate Cuba, they want to leave, everybody in Cuba is suffering because of the Cuban government, that money is flowing in. But if you want to make a song about how you love your country, how you love Cuba, how you're proud of the revolution, you're not getting no money, buddy. So again, that's an example of how hip hop is used against Africans in other places. This presentation is not about hip hop specifically. I talked about jazz. We can also talk about how gospel is used to keep African people in the US and in South Africa complacent, keep them in a state of accepting oppression, whereas the true roots of gospel have always been revolution. But again, this is just to prove the point that our relationship to music and the arts is dialectical. Anything that can be used for a positive purpose can also be used for a negative purpose. So now I'll talk a little bit about what we can do today to ensure that music or art, culture in general, are being used in the correct ways. So I think the first thing is that artists have to stop being afraid to speak truth to power. I mean, when we look back at the Black arts movement, when there were people like Amiri Baraka, when we look back at figures like Nina Simone, people like Paul Robeson, these are people who sacrificed their entire careers. They lost everything. Artists, writers like Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston died without a penny to her name, and she wrote some of the most prolific books for Black people of all time. Amiri Baraka was blacklisted as a communist, uninvited. He lost jobs. Paul Robeson was a singer, an athlete, and an actor. He lost hundreds of gigs. By the time he had been cemented in the U.S. public's mind as a communist, as a tool of the Soviet Union, it was very difficult for him to find work. He was fired from the league. He was fired. He was banned from gigs. He never got another television or Hollywood role. All these things happened to them because they were not afraid to speak truth to power. We look at a lot of artists that exist today. These people do not have shit to say about anything. And not only do they not have anything to say, but it's also probably a good thing that they do not speak, because all of their ideas are counter-revolutionary. So artists need to stop being afraid to speak truth to power. Another thing is that, again, we have to keep in mind our relationship to art and music is dialectical. So we cannot make art and music the center of our revolution. We cannot say our revolution is 100% based on art, music, culture. It can never work. Revolution has to be based on land. It has to be based on revolutionary principles, and it has to be based on material gains for people. People are not fighting and dying in places. People do not fight and die in Algeria or in Haiti or in Guinea people are not fighting or dying in Palestine for a song. They're fighting and dying for freedom. They're fighting and dying for their homelands. We have to keep that in mind. And the last thing I would say is the most important thing, which a lot of people may consider to be an unpopular opinion, but oh well. It is not just enough to be an individual artist to make songs or music or paintings or books about revolutionary causes. You have to partake in the act of building revolution. Artists need to be organizers who are accountable to organization and community, where they can partake in the process of criticism, self-criticism, and democratic centralism. If artists are not in organizations, even at least with each other, if you just make the We Are Artists organization and you guys get into the organization, you practice those things, you will be so much more valuable to the cause of African people. And so I'll end this presentation, wrap this up real quick, with the quote by Imam Jamil Al-Amin, who at the time that he wrote it was known as H. Brown. And I feel like remains very relevant today. So he says, everything must relate to the struggle as a political form. Culture must be political. Nationalism alone is not a political doctrine. Nationalism has to be a part of a political doctrine. Without vanguard political direction, cultural movements bring economic and or political liberalism, not revolution. We must define the difference between political nationalism and cultural nationalism. We must move from Black awareness to revolutionary motion. To be Black is necessary but not sufficient. Every Negro is a potential traitor, and every Black man is only a potential revolutionary, with emphasis on potential. To be Black is not revolutionary. When you begin to stress culture without politics, people can become so hooked up in the beauty of themselves that they have no desire to fight. It becomes gratifying. It becomes ego gratifying just to be Black. Vanguard groups can't afford to go around stressing culture without politics. The real test now is preparation for and initiation of struggle. Write me a novel about how to infiltrate the FBI and destroy it. Write me poems that say more than that you are Black and beautiful. Perform dances with guns to legitimize guns as a weapon of struggle. If you examine any country that has undergone successful revolution, you will find that the Cultural Revolution has never come before actual armed confrontation, never before a contest for power was waged. So thank you again. Like I said, I'm Salifu. I'm a member of the Kaji Work Study Circle of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. This has been another episode of the Pantsula Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. The party also has a ton of other cultural products that you should check out. There's the Forward Ever podcast. There is our Ancestors' Voices, which happens every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. EST. Hosted by Jamil Umi and his daughter Shakora Umi, who are both longtime members of the party. Please be sure to check us out on Twitter and Instagram at A-APRP, most places, Facebook, All African People's Revolutionary Party. Forward.